Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about Bell Primary. Last year we actually rolled out the numeracy PD that we had been doing last year. So for us, we didn't do any literacy training last year. I attended along with another literacy learner. And then this year was our year to do the literacy. So we actually, even though we were involved in the training last year, we actually started putting out the professional learning with our staff this year. So it's sort of a brand new year. We started off with a whole day professional learning back in January in our 3 days, and we actually did it to only half of the staff. And what we actually tried to do is to have one half of the staff start off with the high reliabilities, and then half of the staff went off to do something else. Now, in retrospect, that was actually a very silly thing to have done, because what we've been doing all year is trying to chase our tails, because we've got one expert group and then one group that are trying to constantly catch up. So that was our first mistake and one of our first things that we had to sort of really try and rectify. In the second week of term, so we started out very, very early. John did come out to our school, and like a lot of others, he modelled to a grade 3-4 and week 2 preps, which was quite an interesting session, because for our staff that were involved in watching that, that was preps that had just been in our school for less than 10 days. And yet here he was taking an amazing session that got so much out of those preps. So for us, that was actually a fantastic way of getting all those staff watching on board immediately. If he can do this with preps, less than 10 days in a school, we're right, this will be a fantastic. So it actually worked really well for us. We then went on to some discussing and planning for the rest of the year. And then we set out upon fortnightly professional learning. In our school, our meeting agenda is that we have a fortnightly staff meeting, and then on the alternative Wednesday we have professional learning for the whole staff. And so for term 1 we set out on getting knowledge ready, vocab and review. Review we did every single term. That was one that we kept revisiting and wanting to implement all the way through. In term 2, the fortnightly professional learning continued, and we moved on to reading aloud, paraphrasing and review. At that point we invited a neighbouring school. We're only we were a small school, we are growing now, but we invited another neighbouring school to our professional learning sessions, so that we had more staff, more discussion, and we could share across the experiences across those two schools. We then alternated our professional learning sessions 1 week at our school and 1 week at their school, and that stayed for the whole of term 2. And from that we actually had quite a lot of collegiate discussions and even some shared integrated planning, because we were in some areas doing the same units of work. So that was really exciting to share resources and extend your networks. We then, from there, we had already gone down the path of coaching last year with our numeracy, so staff were quite open to that. So by this stage, nearly 2 terms, we then started to say, okay, put your hand up if you'd like for somebody to come and watch you. Which part of these high reliabilities would you like to model? Which one are you really good at? So we started to release people to go and watch segments. It was about this time that we ended up with 2 new classroom teachers, so halfway through the year. So we had people starting from absolute scratch. We also, at the end of term 2, put in a literacy walk, a little bit different to what James was just talking about, in that we actually walked as a staff after school, prior to a staff meeting, through each of the classrooms to look at what was a literacy-rich classroom and what evidence they could see of the high reliabilities. We found that for our school we wanted to move beyond just using the high reliabilities as verbatim when teachers were taking their sessions on the floor, but we wanted it to be on the walls, the children using the language, displays and evidence all around. And so from that we sort of recognised that there was a niche where classrooms didn't exactly look like literacy-rich classrooms. So from that we sort of said, okay, we're going to start coming along. We had our observation checklist. What could we see? What made a literacy-rich classroom? Term 3, the professional learning continued, and we moved on to the questions and answers and summarising, continued with review. We then did an audit of the high reliabilities across the classrooms, because like a lot of schools have mentioned here, sometimes you get the talk. Yes, I'm doing it and this is what I'm doing, but we weren't seeing the evidence. And so we actually wanted a review and asked teachers to review what they'd done, which bits the kids could actually automatise, which ones were still being modelled, etc. From that audit, we looked at that really we had a hodgepodge sort of approach to what people were doing. Some teachers had taken things on and had modelled and were scaffolding and were moving across. Some teachers were still just using it in their repertoire, in their talking. So what we then did is devised a model where in their planning, teachers had to actually recognise in their normal literacy weekly planning whether they were modelling one of the high reliabilities, whether they were scaffolding it in that particular lesson, or whether they'd already moved to making it automatic. At that point, and I will show an example of that planning. At that point, we also started instructional rounds where our principal came out and watched an entire literacy session, and then you received feedback. And it was, I saw, I observed, I recognised, and so there was a written report and a discussion that happened after that. Term 4. We're continuing to automatise all the high reliabilities and make sure they're fully integrated in the classrooms. We need to review where we are at, and of 11 classrooms next year, only 3 of our teachers will be the same. So we're in a very difficult position in that we have the majority of our staff in completely different classrooms, all new staff. And so we're actually at a cross point thinking we've made a lot of ground and yet only 3 teaching staff will be in the same grade next year. And that's a little bit scary when we're going up a grade anyway. We need to get our data and to sort of fine-tune a lot of our data and to actually be testing those specific high reliabilities that John talked about before. We've put a lot into place using the covers, so, give me getting knowledge ready, using paraphrasing and how many words could they do. So we've started to do that, but we need to keep moving along there. And of course, we're currently developing a literacy plan. Our data collection involved some pre-assessment, which we specifically set out and did in Term 1, and I will show you examples of those. Of course, baseline data collected at school, on English Online, NAPLAN, school-based data, and the instructional rounds actually provided a fantastic body of observations where we were able to actually take a snapshot of the language being used, the frequency of which the students were responding, the literacy-rich prompts around the room, the resources being made, and the strategies being used by students. So we were able to capture that back in Term 1 and Term 2, do it again in Term 3 and do it again this term. So as we get our reports from our principal, we start to see that, okay, our observations are showing that there's been growth. This is what one of our planning documents looks like when I specifically said that we actually had to look at which strategy you were actually using, whether the focus was to scaffold the students, to model it to the students, or to actually move into making it automatic. So staff were then asked to recognise which text it was or what the activity was, the scaffolding, the text that they would be using with their students. So on that one, volcanic eruption, that was one of mine. So look at the title, what questions. So actually making sure that the staff had planned exactly how they were going to take this to the next level. And then what was the follow-up for those students. And so we asked our staff to plan at this level, week by week or fortnightly, for each of the texts that they would use in their literacy block. Specifically so that we could make sure we had the scaffolding, modelling and automatising down packed and staff knew what they were up to and what they had to do. Okay, that just continues. You can see there one of the keywords and reading aloud, what they had to do. There's automatising and scaffolding going on, and then the activity that had to be done.